Hello there. My name is Sean, and I'm a content creator that has covered game revival projects such as SAVEMGO, which has been responsible for the revival and current support of Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots multiplayer mode called Metal Gear Online. Being the passionate individual that I am, I have a lot to say about the idea of game preservation as a whole, and have had issues with the idea of live services terminating their service, rendering the game unplayable all the way back since 2012 when Metal Gear Online itself was shut down by Konami all those years ago. And well, since the topic has been brought up due to the Stop Killing Games initiative taking place in the EU, it has brought a lot of conversation and argumentation for and against it. The biggest one being Thor, otherwise known as Pirate Software. If you don't know who Thor is, he is a game developer that has worked in the industry for almost 20 years and is a content creator that pushes people to create their own games and gives tons of resources on how to do so. He constantly streams showing his process when working on whatever project he might be doing at the time and is always answering questions people might have when it comes to the industry or game development in general. I say all of this because I want to make it very clear. This video is not meant to be any hatred towards Thor. If anything, I have nothing but respect for the guy. But his arguments against this initiative specifically bring the developer side of the conversation and is something worth listening to and understanding. So what I want to do is just that. Go through his points and make my own rebuttals wherever possible and look at the Stop Killing Games website itself to get my own point of view across on this whole thing.
The reason why I have a problem with Stop Killing Games is specifically it starts the wrong conversation. If we're trying to kill off the practice of developers putting together a live service game, pitching it as a single player experience, and then taking away support in the future, this ain't it. And the reason why is specifically on this initiative, under its own description, it says, this initiative calls to require publishers that sell or license video games to consumers in the European Union or related features and assets sold for video games they operate to leave said video games in a functional playable state. Specifically, the initiative seeks to prevent the remote disabling of video games by the publishers before providing reasonable means to continue functioning of said video games without the involvement from the side of the publisher. This isn't always possible in all video games, and it doesn't call out the specific practice that this is supposedly trying to defeat. It is incredibly vague and will damage all live service games.
Except that I feel that the vagueness in the wording was already addressed in Ross's own video. It's vague because not every game is designed exactly the same. The way a live service model can be implemented can vary drastically, so leaving the game in a playable state will require different approaches depending on the game. This isn't just about one type of live service game, since despite their differences, all of these games have the same situation befall them when they reach the end of life. They all become inaccessible. Ultimately, leaving a game in a quote-unquote playable state can be as simple as allowing private servers to be made if it's a game that has a multiplayer mode or is an MMO. We've already had plenty of examples of games that got revived that needed no help from the developer to do so. Like we have games like Terra, we have Metal Gear Online is another example. We have North Star, even the old Call of Duty games have their own private servers running. And you know, it's funny. As I was editing this, I got reminded as to why Activision is a very good example to mention when it comes to this entire initiative. The reason for it is the H2M mod that was supposed to reestablish the Modern Warfare 2 multiplayer just got recently hit with a cease and desist a day before it was supposed to come out publicly for everybody to enjoy. And that was supposed to reestablish the Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 multiplayer. And I think it's very beautiful that this has to happen during this time of all times, not just because Activision was selling the game and still receiving monetary compensation for all this hype that this mod was building, but because it is a testament to how inaccessible Activision is keeping the old Call of Duty games while still selling them for outrageous prices. These games are basically only playable for the campaign at this moment. And if you try to play the multiplayer, you're just going to have a bad time. And not only does the company not do anything about it, it is not reflected in the pricing, and it is not informed to the consumer that this is currently the state the game is in. And so, shutting down these projects that are meant to make the games more playable, whether or not you want to argue they have good reason for it because of the assets being used or anything like that, Activision is leaving these games in the state, not doing anything to fix it, let alone compensate the consumer for basically buying a faulty product. These games are basically kept in this state so long as Activision keeps shutting down these projects. And I feel like this is a prime example of where there should be an exception that should allow consumers to be able to fix these games and put them in a playable state if the company refuses to do it themselves. While it would be nice to have a law that forces the company to have to put them in a playable state, the application of this is not going to be able to work across the board because, like Thor said, there may be companies that literally don't exist anymore to be able to do this in the first place. So I feel like there needs to be a middle ground here when it comes to what a playable state is supposed to mean. And I feel like the consumer's own autonomy in being able to fix the game themselves to make it playable should be allowed under specific circumstances. And I personally think that circumstance is one like this, where the developer is not providing a suitable alternative to the game's accessibility. And no, selling a sequel would not count here. And this would also apply to live service games that are basically free-to-play games. While they are free to download, there's still monetary exchanges being occurred here of content that is no longer going to be accessible in the near future. So I feel like this would still apply to these games as well.
So this isn't going to work for all games. Why is it calling out all games? And it's really easy to say that'll get worked out down the line. But we're dealing with government here. If we're going to be putting up these types of ideas specifically in front of government, we need to be calling out the right issues, especially if you don't have precedent set. Because now you're going to be setting precedent on something that doesn't make any sense with people that may not understand the nuance of our industry, all in the name of saving games. I can't agree with that.
Just because not every game will be able to have the same implementation of the solution doesn't mean that the end result wouldn't be the same. The whole point is to keep these games accessible for the consumer. And the reason they are not accessible is because of arbitrary online requirements that can and have been circumvented by people in the past. So it doesn't matter the various forms this has to take as long as the end result of the game being accessible is able to be achieved. And a lot of this can be done without much need for the developer to even do anything in the first place. They just need to make it not impossible. The right issues is also that games as a service allows for the complete destruction of games post end of life. That's all that's being asked to be prevented. You want to point to something else, which is the wording on how these games are sold to the consumer, which is a fine idea, but it would still leave these games unable to be preserved. And for the kind of money that these games pull in, it doesn't seem unreasonable to try and preserve them. And well, this is both a consumer rights issue as much as it is a preservation issue. Because as much as the wording of you're not buying the game, you're buying a license might help in terms of keeping the language clear at the time of purchase, it still leaves the big issue of these games essentially being taken off the face of the planet once their service is terminated with no further recourse. And I don't see how that's going to be accepted by consumers, even if you try to make the argument that they don't own the game in question. It should still be preserved for future generations to be enjoyed in some playable form. I do get the developers should have a way to revoke access to the game during its active life, but I feel we can have something like that while also acknowledging that a game at the end of life should not be restricted from ever being played again, just because we can't have the game be able to run offline or have a private server. Honestly, I'm going to be mentioning private servers practically every time because that's literally the biggest example that currently exists that is already being done for tons of games as it is.
First off, I don't like the idea in this that it has a player base of 12 million people. That is not how long-running games work. There is a large number of people that buy the game, and that player base slowly dwindles off until nobody is playing it anymore. If there's any costs associated with keeping the game online, which this was an online video game, then eventually it costs more to keep it online than it does to keep running it, right? So the cost outweighs the amount of income for it. There are bad business practices that can occur in there. There are companies that will sell a online-only game as a single-player experience and kind of just put it into the TOS and hide it. But not all companies do that. When they do, we should be calling out that specific company, not all companies.
I agree that the player base of a game like The Crew, especially near the end of its life, is not huge. Even Metal Gear Online only has, at best, about 200 players playing it at one time on a good day. But I feel we're entering a slippery slope to suggest that a game that doesn't have a ton of people playing it by the time the servers shut down shouldn't have some way to still have the access to the game post-mortem.
It is an online-only service-based game, and they shut it down 10 years later. On March 31st, 2024, Ubisoft shut down the game's servers, rendering the game unplayable, which is normal for live service games. The only thing that I can see in here that could be a problem is if they posted as not an online-only experience. But everything that I found online shows that the game was always marketed as online only. If you're going to be buying an online-only game, that means it can only run when it's online. And if the servers need to shut down in the future, far in the future, it makes sense to me for the access to that game to be cut if it's online only. If it's a single player experience that has online only functionality specifically just to shut down the game in the future, and the online only doesn't actually add any gameplay functionality, I'd agree with you. That's a shitty business practice, but that's really rare. And in the specific cases where it does happen, we should call out that, not just all games and not all live service games. You can't run a live service game on this few players. You can't. Most of the time, especially not if there's anything else that goes into it. And if we go into that anything else, and we could see that there was license problems.
Yes, the circumstances surrounding the Crew shutdown aren't without good reasons, but that hasn't stopped any other game with similar licensing constraints from still being accessible. The older Need for Speed games aren't being sold anymore, and yet there are plenty of ways to get and play them still. Yes, they are single player, but licensing issues still apply to games even if they're not online, and nothing stops those games from still being preserved, even though they will also have licensed things, whether it be like music, cars, product placements, etc. But you also have Need for Speed World, which is an early attempt at a racing MMO, which could also count as a live service, getting a private server where you get to experience the game anyway. The examples are honestly endless, because this has always been an issue with games, having an online server connection as a requirement to play said games. This is not just exclusive to live services, this is just what we're calling them now. But any game that requires an online server connection to access any part of the game has always had this issue of once it's gone for good, and unless you can find somebody talented enough to bring the game back by force, that's your only recourse. Technically, they're not allowed to do this. It's just that these games are old enough to the point where the company probably doesn't care or would be financially de-incentivized to go after and shut all of them down. There's more nuance to that, of course. Like they may be in another country where they can't be reached or anything like that. Point is that there's tons of these games that would not be playable today if it were not for the efforts of all the people that still love these games and want to see them stay around.
You're going to have to renegotiate on a game that has so few players and is not turning a profit anymore. You're probably just going to forego the renegotiation. And if those servers are aging, you're not going to want to recreate that infrastructure. And there are some people that'll say, well, just make it all single player. Well, I've explained that doesn't make any sense in the first place. If you're making it all single player, you'd have to carve off all of that, and it's developer time and money. When you already have sequels out and the game has basically no players left anyway, it makes more sense to just move on.
And I don't think you'll find many people that'll disagree with the idea that developers should be allowed to terminate service and move on to other things if they want to, or if it's not financially viable, that they just terminate service for that reason, period. The problem this is supposed to address, though, is that what happens to these games after that? And the answer should be is that if the players can find a way to still play the game themselves, they should be allowed to. And I don't think that's unreasonable to suggest. Yes, the developer can provide additional means to make that happen if they want to, but it shouldn't be forced upon them to do so.
I don't find that to be a problem from the developer perspective, and I understand that people find that to be a problem from the player perspective. These are two different ideologies, and that's okay to have two different ideologies. I just won't agree with it because I understand the burden that puts if we raise that problem in the way that we are right now. If you try to tell me that every studio needs to run their live service game indefinitely or not want to run one at all, then no one's going to run them. And we're going to miss out on adventures like Final Fantasy XIV. And even though I don't play anymore, League of Legends or any other live service game, any of them. You're talking everything, like even phone games, as funny as that is. A lot of people don't realize that phone games require online-only activity. What about things like Pokemon Go? What about stuff like Monster Hunter Now? What about any of these? We'd never get any of them. And that's why I think this needs to not be vague. It needs to be specific about the business practice it's trying to defeat, which is specifically companies that are doing this under the guise of it being a single-player game, but adding online-only functionality that is not necessary and doesn't add any gameplay elements. That's the problem.
If you want to look at all the games that we've gotten because of the live service model, then you need to also take a step back and look at all the ones that we've lost along the way. Yes, we've had some amazing experiences that can only be achieved due to the live service model, but that doesn't justify having these games be completely inaccessible for the end of time. I wouldn't want people to never be able to experience Final Fantasy XIV's story. But I want to get to this point specifically. No one is suggesting that the developer has to keep the game running indefinitely. And the initiative is not doing anything in particular that prevents games from like this to continue being made. The developer can do whatever they want to the game as long as it's an active service. And they can still do anything they want during that service. There's nothing suggesting that that would change. The only thing that changes is that they can't just up and shut the game down and stop people from finding ways to still play the game. But after this point, the video Thor calls out the way Ross, the creator of the Stop Killing Games initiative, goes about explaining the initiative. He mentions a lot here, but ultimately Thor has a point that's saying that this initiative will be an easy pass because politicians want it easy, as true as that might be, because we already know how politics are in the countries. It still won't sound good to the people that this will be enforced upon, which is developers. Like it or not, developers should not be treated as enemies here, as a lot of the times they have no choice in the things that they're implementing. And an indie studio that might have more control over these decisions wouldn't be considered here because they're not massive enough to be the main source of the hatred that the live service model has gotten anyway. Ross has stated that he's definitely a pessimist when it comes to these portions of the video, but I feel it's more than reasonable to say that maybe we shouldn't intentionally try and come at this in bad faith. At the end of the day, you'd want as many developers to agree with this as possible, which when it comes to preservation, I've seen way more developers be for games being brought back or being tinkered with to do amazing things with them than I've seen the opposite. But that sort of ends my thoughts on the first video. But Thor gives a response on a second video to a lot of the takes that he got. So let's review those as well.
Let's say that you made your own video game and you made a live service game. Maybe it's an MMO, maybe it's something else, right? And let's say that I want to monetize that game, but you don't allow monetization of the game by any other party. This makes sense because most creators don't allow for that. You can't just take someone else's art and profit off of it. Normal, right? So then I go, well, how am I going to force you to do this? Under this initiative, you would have to release the server binaries or keep the game in a functional playable state at end of life. So I hit you with a ton of bots. I hit you with a ton of exploits. I attack your community. I destroy your Reddit. I go after your business. I go everywhere that I possibly can to make this cost as much as it possibly can for you. And it's not hard to do this. We saw the exact same thing happen in TF2 recently. The massive amount of bots that were attacking the game. This is not infeasible. This is something that is very easily attainable today. And let's say that this goes on long enough that your game dies because you can't afford it anymore and your studio has to shut down. At end of life, you now have to release those server binaries to keep the game in a functional playable state. At which point I take those, I create a private server, and I monetize it. And some people have said, well, simply don't allow monetization of the server. Well, who's going to enforce that? If you want a government initiative to enforce that, that means the government has to build a registry of all of those games and all of that intellectual property that shouldn't be monetized, and then somehow enforce that with no one owning it because those studios have shut down. That's going to be a massive burden.
I feel like the part that really makes this point stick is the way the FAQ is written. Because even though you add on the rest of the way the FAQ is done, this one part makes it implied that the developer has to do something, even though there are options where the developer doesn't have to do anything. But setting that aside for a moment, I still don't think the example Thor gives here makes much sense to me. Unless the game is extremely successful, like say the example being used here, which is Team Fortress 2, which has lasted a long time with a dedicated community, mind you, would something like this even be lucrative to anyone intending to do this on purpose? Keep in mind, all the attacks listed here already happened without this initiative. Imagining a scenario where this would be done on purpose for the kind of gain, like a monetizable server, feels like a monumentous reach, simply because so much would need to align for it to ever be the case. Not to mention, doing this would mean the live service game stops getting content, so intentionally attempting this on an already thriving game would still be seen as an act of malice. And again, this hasn't stopped anyone from doing that as it is, and I don't think the initiative changes that to be a legal route for people to do so, when the monetization could still be something the developer could get protections for. And they would deal with those issues the same way they already do. A second take I can add is that I'd argue for some games, these kind of scenarios are nothing but beneficial to the game and the creator. Because if the game is still being sold, then the developer still gets paid for new players getting the game, just to play on a private server that expands the game and is able to take to areas the vanilla versions did not. GTA RP comes to mind, though I understand it's not monetized directly, but as far as I remember, they did take donations. I see some parallel here with private servers and custom frameworks, or mods like FiveM, where it can just as easily be beneficial to the game's longevity and the developer as much as the potential Doomsday scenario being outlined here. But the most realistic outcome that I see is that of Metal Gear Online, a small dedicated server that won't exactly be competing with other games of its type anytime soon. A free-to-play game would be the situation where this can get a little gray. You don't technically purchase the game, the developer doesn't benefit from more sales should a private server take off, so this is the one where I feel special exceptions would need to be made, because yes, people did pay money for those microtransactions, but this is one where I feel taking the game off of stores and doing an offline version or just a new paid version that allowed private servers and selling that post-mortem would even things out to where it's a beneficial arrangement again. While consumers might still dismay at something like this is a compromise I feel could work.
After putting this out publicly and talking to people about it, this specific scenario on both YouTube and Discord and Reddit and a bunch of other locations, I got a couple of takes back. We're going to start with the most extreme position and kind of go from there. So, in the most extreme, people said live service games shouldn't exist at all, and the initiative will kill them off for good, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, I just want to say that's a completely nonsensical point. Live service games may be egregious, especially some gacha games, but that's no reason to champion this and say this initiative is good because it will kill some of them off. What would be ideal is for them to do things in a way that aren't so scummy, but that still allows these games to be made.
Well, you don't get to define what players get to play or not play. You also shouldn't be able to get to define what developers build or don't build. You should not have creative control over the developers, and you should not have control over what is in my Steam library or on my phone. That doesn't make any goddamn sense.
Yes, it's true that individuals cannot tell you what you can and cannot make, but laws, whether in this country or others, do. I mean, if you have to change the content in your game for cultural or religious reasons, or the result will be that your game is banned from sale, I feel like that's also a direct influence over creative work. Now, if you want to suggest that these laws go too far and have too much influence, then I can concede this point there, because this shows it has been done before, but it can also be way too extreme. For players, this is also the case, with China essentially capping your progression if you play the game for too long, so I don't know to what extent these things could or should be implemented, but...
Aside from that, the initiative does not purport to kill live service games. It would just make it incredibly difficult to build said games and add a lot of risk to it, which is why I'm bringing all of this up and why I don't support the initiative in the first place. A lot of people don't realize that this will slowly diminish live service games in the market, because it's not an incentive for us to build them anymore, which means you get less multiplayer live experiences. That sucks. I like live service games. I enjoy playing things like Final Fantasy XIV. I enjoy going and playing in games, in the past at least, like League of Legends. These are games that are live service. They require a live service to run. And you shouldn't be able to take that away from people. And if that's your only position on this, not only are you disingenuous in what the initiative is purporting to try and achieve, but you're also aggressively attacking other players instead of trying to fix something.
If allowing players to build and support the game with their own servers, which doesn't require the developer to do anything to assist in some situations, is enough of a risk to reduce or outright kill off live service as games, then I don't know what made them enticing to make in the first place. These games make money hand over fist, and if it's a franchise, then there's nothing to suggest that would change. However, what would change is that there would be no option to do planned obsolescence in order to entice players to participate in the next game. Not that this would even stop games anyway. Literally look at Hoyoverse, a company with not one, not two, but 4 live service games, all existing in tandem with each other. So really, the only reason you'd have to point this out is because you're under the impression developers have to release the server binaries, which fair enough, that's too much control to give to people in some situations, and I can understand that. But if we want to go with the idea that the initiative makes it clear that it's not necessary, then that's just an example of how to make these things playable. There's nothing indicating that live service games wouldn't be able to continue operating the way they currently have, as it's implied that the developer can do whatever they wanted during the game's active service. The thing that would change is that people wouldn't have these games taken away from them.
So the next one is that this is about games preservation, and that it needs to happen to preserve these types of games for future generations and for everyone to always have forever. But I would argue that this isn't actually preserving these games. Social games, such as, let's say, Apex Legends, require a number of players to be in the match at the same time so that you can have an experience that is only able to be obtained through lots of players interacting, right? It's a multiplayer game, you need a bunch of people. How many of you have felt negatively when an MMO dies? Or when a live service game dies? Oh, dead game. There's only 5 people online, why would I play that? So why would you want to preserve a game in that state? That doesn't make any sense to me. You want to take down these live service games, put them up on a private server, and then play it with a couple of people. You're not bringing it back at its height. You're not taking a snapshot of what the game actually is. You're making it limp on in a way that doesn't make any sense. That's not preservation.
But the way you are currently making this point is saying that the game should be taken away from people once the service shuts down, and your reason for it being okay is that you wouldn't be able to preserve the game exactly the way it was due to the dwindling population or lack thereof, since player interaction is a core part of these games. And all this goes without saying. The implication we shouldn't be preserving these things because they may be failures goes against a lot of what we've already done. For example, there is a museum out there that is literally for failures. And if a museum can exist to preserve these failed products, whether it be for various reasons, then the same can happen for live service games that shut down for being failures. Final Fantasy 1.0 is a great example of this. It is a failure, but it should be preserved so people get to experience why that was. And so far, you can actually do that. Another point that this brings up that is worth looking at is that this opens the door to also attack emulation. You're not playing the game as it was originally intended whenever you're doing an emulation. Should these games not be preserved because you can't play them on the original hardware the way it was intended to? Honestly, this can go on and on. There will always be a what about is situation that we can bring up to kind of counteract each other. And it really shouldn't be about that. A low population is never a good reason to not preserve a game. And yeah, he shot down the idea of private servers, but the only reason he did is because of the expectation of the devs having to do something on their end to be compliant with it. Now, if Thor has a more in-depth reason, I'd love to hear it, but at least from my perspective, the only point he has that makes this a hard thing for it to be done, it's the implication of the devs having to hand over the server binaries. Yeah, the wording could definitely be more clear on this, but I don't think it would necessarily silence the demand for some form of end-of-life plan, or some form of exceptions to be in place of games for game preservation's sake. And while I could argue the game and the service should be 2 different things you're getting when buying the game, but that just goes into me not agreeing with how licenses are sold to consumers. And well, it would leave free-to-play games up in the air as well, so it's not a solid enough point that I have that I'd go as far to defend it. But I do believe, no matter what, the angle of wanting to preserve these games remains, no matter what angle is taken here. A lack of a server population does not mean that one wouldn't grow in the future, albeit a smaller one. But to shut the door on that possibility doesn't make sense to me. The fact that people are willing to go to such lengths to keep the games they loved around, even if so many have moved on, is a great thing to have. Some games don't get that luxury, but you have no idea what the future would have. New fans may pop up, new generations that get to experience something they never would have otherwise. And that to me is something worth fighting for. At the end of the day, I'm glad that Thor is bringing the developer side to the conversation. I don't know if what I had to say was able to understand it all fully and give a good reply to all of it, but I will leave it to you, my fellow people of the internet, to decide. I just wanted to throw my 2 cents in and at least have this conversation without trying to attack the other person. The points being brought up should be the main focus, not the person's character or their past. Anyway, that's all I have on this. Please show Thor some respect and not harass him to make another statement or anything like that. And if that happens anyway, well, I'm sorry you had to do this again, Thor.